Yo, what's up, chefs? Today we're going to be making a Dungeonborne tier list for solos, duos, and trios. Just for a little bit of context about me, I've played over 1,500 hours of Dark and Darker, multiple playtests. I've gotten multiple classes to top 10 on the leaderboard on multiple occasions during different wipes. When it comes to Dungeonborne, I've also played in multiple playtests for this game. Since early access, I've put over 80 hours into the game, playing a plethora of different classes in solos, duos, and trios. I've mostly played solos, and I got rank 1 Cryomancer for Clusal Castle casual on that mode, but I've also branched out to duos and trios quite a bit recently, and I feel like I have a pretty solid understanding of the meta in those game modes as well. Additionally, this is going to be as of the most recent patch on July 29th. There were some pretty substantial changes in that patch, so some things could be subject to change, but I have done some testing today and it doesn't seem like, well, it did affect a couple of my placements, but not too much overall. Finally, this is going to be for people that are wearing decent gear. This tier list may be applicable to, but is not tailored to people wearing default kits or people wearing super bis with full purples and legendaries and things of that nature. Think anywhere from like 20 to 150k gold, priced kits, and that's probably what we're looking at for this tier list. Finally, this is all going to be my opinion, so if you don't like it, it's unfortunate, but it is just my opinion, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. So let's get things started with the solos tier list. Alrighty, starting things off with the solos tier list, and I do just want to quickly say that I'm not going to be ordering the classes within their tiers, so you can assume if there are multiple classes within the same tier, they're going to be relatively the same strength. I did include an S plus tier because I think in solos, duos, and trios, there are a couple of classes that really set themselves apart from the rest of the pack, but we'll get into that as we actually lay out the tier list. But starting things off, we're going to have the fighter. For solos, I'm going to be ranking fighters A tier. Unfortunately, I think they're a bit slow. I think A tier is still pretty solid. They can definitely hold their own against every other class, but you're going to be putting yourself at a bit of a disadvantage compared to playing like an S plus tier class, mainly because they're a bit slow. I will say there are some builds out there that I think people are starting to come around to, using dual wield swords as an example, mace and shield. Really solid weapon combo, both of them respectively, and also using some different skills. I think Whirlwind is not all that powerful, and people are starting to figure that out slowly but surely, so I think Fighter's going to be solidly put in the A tier for solos. Next up, we have the Swordmaster. Swordmaster is going to be the first class going into S plus tier. They did not get nerfed at all in this most recent patch, and I would have already said that they were probably one of the top 3 best classes in the game, and the other 2 of the best 3 did actually get nerfed during this patch. So prior to this patch, I probably would have put Swordmaster in S and not in S+, but I think at this point they definitely are an S+ class. And ultimately their competition got taken down a bit of a notch, so it did actually help Swordmaster out a little bit. I do believe they still should probably look at the 50% damage reduction perk that they have. Might need to be toned down just a little bit. Next up, we have Priest. Priest is going to be one of the lowest ranked class in the solos tier list. Unfortunately, there's not really a place for Priests and solos in this game. There are a couple of people, very rarely, who are figuring out some tech for solo Priest and kind of making it work. But generally speaking, you're definitely at a big disadvantage in solos if you make the decision to play Priest, and they definitely shine much more in group play. Following that, we have the Rogue, which I'm actually going to be putting in the S tier. I know a lot of people kind of struggle with Rogue, and especially in Dark and Darker, but also in Dungeonborne, people have a tendency to think Rogue is kind of weak. Although I think in Dungeonborne, people are really coming around to the fact that Rogue is quite strong in the right hands. And it's evidence of this by certain people on the leaderboard. One of the highest ranked solo players is a rogue with 7.6 average kills. Although I do think the class is a bit harder to make work than something like Swordmaster that can kind of just press E and W key you, has insanely high range damage with their Q. However, there are some builds for Rogue that are definitely really strong right now. Most of them rely on using the crossbow very effectively, kind of going in and out, doing insanely high burst damage, but you are pretty squishy, high skill ceiling, difficult to play, but still firmly in the S tier. Up next, we've got the Druid. Druid is going to be joining the Swordmaster up in the S plus tier. I know they got nerfed in the patch today, or in the most recent patch on the 29th, but I don't think the nerfs were significant enough to drop them out of the S plus tier, and they even got some supplemental buffs along with their nerfs, increasing the damage of Panther Form's basic attack and the Shadow Pounce, which do make Panther Form do a lot of damage right now. The nerf to the wall hacks was not all that significant. I'm going to be honest, I've tested Druid today and it's still extremely strong. 5 meters, it's less than 30, but it's still a lot. You have a 5-second recharge timer on your wall hacks, but they last for 3 seconds. So basically every 5 seconds you can see through walls for 3 and you can't for 2. So you've got like 60% wall hacks. It's still extremely strong. They do insanely high burst damage with their Tree, Thunderclap, Storm Staff combo. The patch notes did address the fact that they're thinking about looking at Thunderclap Flask to reduce the synergy between Thunderclap and the Lightning Staff, which I think until they do that, we're going to see a lot of the Lightning Staff classes be extremely strong in all different game modes in Dungeonborne. So for all of those reasons together, Druid is going to be 100% in the S plus tier. After Druid, we have the Pyromancer. Now I've gone back and forth on this one a couple of times. I feel like they could be an A, S, S plus. You could really make an argument for any of these. Unfortunately, I don't see that many Pyromancers in solos, but usually the ones I do are either like a free kill or they're just hitting me with a Pyroblast and doing half my HP, and it feels pretty difficult to play against. Additionally, on the leaderboard, Pyros are doing quite well, so I think tentatively I'm going to put them in S tier. I 100% know they're strong in the right hands, but I don't know if they're strong enough to be considered in the same tier as Druid and Swordmaster at this point. They're a little bit more fragile. Their E is not the best at peeling for themselves. It's definitely not as good as Druid's leap, being able to leap multiple times on a pretty short cooldown. So yeah, I think they're really strong. They do insanely high damage, very good for running around in a lobby and just blowing people up, especially people that are in much lower gear than you in like Classic. You can, nuke those people and then just keep moving. But like I said, I don't think they're quite in the same echelon as Swordmaster and Druid, so they're going to be finding themselves in the S tier. Following the Pyro, and we have the Death Knight. I'm going to be putting the Death Knight in the A tier. Unfortunately, I do really like Death Knight. I mained it in one of the playtests, but I think it struggles with some of the same issues as Fighter. Doesn't mean it's a bad class. I think it can still 100% hold its own against every other class in the game. And ultimately, I think the balance in Dungeonborne overall is quite solid, except in a couple of niche scenarios where people are really like taking things to the max, double lightning staff with thunderclaps. Obviously a big problem that needs to be toned down. But at the end of the day, I think Death Knight's still pretty strong. Just struggles with the fact that it's a little bit slow. And yeah, it's kind of hard for it to find its place amongst the top classes in solos, given the current state of the game. But similar to Fighter, I think people are coming around to dual wield swords, mace and shield, and as people get better with these weapon combos, I do think the classes could, find themselves higher up on the tier list. Certain things you can do with Death Knight and Fighter with the mace and shield. You can charge up the heavy attack, and obviously you're really slow while it's charging, but once it's fully charged, you go back to full speed. Using things like this to bait out a Cryomancer's Ice Storm or bait out a Druid's Tree, and then using the heavy attack to dash forward or dash backwards, whatever's necessary in the moment. Using things like this to really bait out the devastating utility of some of these ranged classes will start to make these melee classes more effective, but we're just not quite there yet. Finally, for the solos tier list, one of my personal favorites, as you guys know, is going to be Cryomancer. Now, I did go back and forth on this one a little bit as well. Realistically, whether or not I wanted to put it in S or S+, I definitely think the class is extremely strong, but given the nerfs that it received today, and honestly, even before the nerfs it received today, I think it really finds its place in the S tier. I do think it's an extremely strong class, but I don't think it's in the same tier as Swordmaster and Druid, similar to Rogue and Pyro, or for some similar reasons. Cryomancer's Ice Armor ability for solos is very strong, but it's not the same level of, get out of jail free card as Druid's Panther Jump. There's also nothing really in their kit that compares to Swordmaster's 50% damage reduction. They are very oppressive if you can, pull up on somebody from a long distance and you can start slowing them from a long distance using your fire staff or looking for the perfect opportunity to thunderclap into double lightning staff. But in situations where you open a door and there's somebody right in your face, you don't have these options that Swordmaster and Druid do, where, if you open a door and someone's in your face on Swordmaster, you just press E and, you collect your loot real quick, no big deal. On Druid, if someone's right in your face or a fighter charges on you and starts whirlwinding, you can just Panther form, leap away, you're good to go. But Cryo, Pyro, Rogue don't exactly have those same options. So for that reason, I think Cryo is going to be finding itself firmly in the S tier. And that's going to conclude the solos tier list. Hope you guys stick around for the duos and trios. We're going to cover those next. Alrighty, hopping into the duos tier list, and honestly, duos is one of my favorite modes in this game so far. I actually think the time to kill is really good in duos. It's maybe a bit too quick in trios if you ever get caught out by 3 people, getting lightning staffed, you're just getting mollywopped. In solos, I like the fact that it's pretty long, but it is pretty long, and duos kind of feels like a mixture of those two quite well. It also doesn't have much of an issue with a really, much of an imbalance with ranged classes versus melee from what I can tell so far. So I've really been having a lot of fun in duos, but let's go ahead and get started with the fighter once again. But this time they're going to be finding themselves in the S tier for a lot of the reasons I just talked about though. But beyond that, in a duo setting, they're very easy to work with. They can go in pretty quickly. They can do a lot of burst damage, which will mess up a lot of comps. They don't take damage from their partners given certain perks, so this makes them more effective in group play in solos in solos. And they can also, you can also run a crossbow if you want. I don't actually think you should, but generally speaking, I think fighter is quite strong in duos and definitely firmly in the S tier. Following the fighter, and we've got the priest. They are moving up a tier in duos, but not by too much. I'm still going to be putting them in B. I will say this is kind of tentative because I haven't seen many priests in duos, but from what I can tell and, based on what I understand, I don't think they're actually getting enough players in their party to really get the maximum value, obviously, and this does make them pretty lackluster in duos. Ultimately, you could say it comes down to just the fact that they're not nearly as self-sufficient as the other classes. And in duos, you really want 2 self-sufficient classes that can peel for themselves, can engage, can disengage, can kite, can, run in super quickly. All of these things are pretty valuable in a duos comp, which unfortunately Priest just doesn't really excel in any of those areas. After the Priest, we have the Rogue. This time though, I'm going to be putting Rogue in A tier. I do think Rogue is pretty strong in duos, but it's dropping a tier kind of for the inverse reasons that fighter went up a tier. Rogue is not particularly easy to combo with, and a lot of times I think if you want to be the most viable, you would do like a double Rogue comp if you're, if I had to choose. I think that's because Rogue has a very particular playstyle. They don't really go in the same way as other classes. They don't really kite quite the same as other classes. They're much faster than most of the other classes. And generally, they're just pretty particular in how they want to play fights, so I don't think they get along too well with the other classes, and for these reasons, I think they're going to find themselves in the A tier. But like I said, double Rogue comp, definitely really strong. Following the Rogue, and we have the Pyro. Pyro is once again going to be finding itself in the S tier. I think for a lot of the same reasons it was strong in solos, it's still strong in duos. Does insanely good burst damage, very effective in the neutral game where like both teams are kind of just looking at each other. makes it very hard to approach the team with the pyro because you might get chunked for half your HP. Um, they're relatively quick, but not as quick as most of the other classes. Their E is pretty good peel, same as solos. So yeah, I think for all of these reasons, they're going to find themselves in the S tier for duos. Moving on, and we have the Death Knight. For a lot of the same reasons as the fighter, they're going to be going up from A to S tier in duos. Their major weakness of being slow in solos is a lot less exploitable in duos when you have a partner to rely on that can kind of, measure those weaknesses for you. Additionally, their AoE damage around them doesn't do damage to their teammates, so if you want to run a double melee comp, you don't have to worry about that causing an issue. Their death grip is really good for isolating one of the two targets. You can nuke down that target and then play to reset, get your HP back to full, re-engage the last target, and fight over the loot of the original player that died. All in all, very tanky, good frontline, super strong, a lot of damage. A bit difficult to play if I'm being honest. Like, you really need to know how to use your mace and shield. If you're not using it properly, you're going to push too far forward. You're going to get yourself thunderclapped. You're going to get, 5 different sets of lightning strikes dropped on your head from 2 casters, and you're just going to instantly die. So you do have to be wary of situations like that. You need to know when to go in and when not to. But once you get those things down, it's definitely a very strong class. Going to be safely in the S tier. Following the Death Knight, we have the Cryomancer. This is going to be the first class going into the S plus tier for duos. Ultimately, a lot of their strength comes down to the fact that Ice Storm seems to be insanely strong in group play. If you ever, thunderclap somebody, follow it up with an Ice Storm, they're damn near rooted for like 4 to 5 seconds at that point. If you happen to have another caster on your comp, it's even better, because hopefully one, if not both of you, are running double lightning staff. While that person's rooted, you can just unleash, death and destruction on them with the lightning staffs, and you typically can just instantly get a kill off of one successfully landed Ice Storm. Obviously, people are coming around to this, and they're trying to learn and figure out new ways to avoid the Ice Storm. Like I said, double dagger on fighter, dual wield sword, or mace and shield also have options to kind of move you around, especially the mace and shield, but even dual wield swords, you can dash a little bit. But for the people that don't know how to effectively use these strategies, which are most players that you run into at this point, Ice Storm is pretty much a death sentence if you get hit by it against good players. So any comp that has a Cryomancer has a very high likelihood of success in duos and trios right now, for that matter. Following the Cryomancer, and we have the Swordmaster. They are also going to be joining them in the S plus tier, cementing themselves as the premier melee class in duos, melee quote unquote, but ultimately the 50% damage reduction passive perk for their E makes them extremely tanky, comparably so to the Death Knight and Fighter, assuming you're playing around that cooldown properly. In addition to that, they have extremely high range damage burst with their Q. They can heal with their Q. They can use a sword and shield, which is very clutch in a lot of situations. They're extremely quick, pretty much only outpaced by the rogue at this point, post druid movement speed nerfs. So for these reasons, they're 100% finding themselves in the S plus tier. If you're going to run a melee class in your duos comp, Swordmaster is going to be your best choice. Finally, we have the Druid, also going to be joining the other 2 most recent classes in the S plus tier. For a lot of the same reasons as solos, they're once again extremely strong. They have access to the lightning staff, which pairs extremely well with the Cryomancer, creating a very deadly synergy. If you ever land an Ice Storm on somebody, you have a couple of people drop some lightning strikes on them, they're probably going to fall over. In addition to that, the wall hacks is honestly just more impactful in group play than in solos. It's extremely impactful in all of the game modes, but being able to provide that information to not only yourself, but also your teammate is very valuable. You can coordinate things a little bit better than, by yourself in solos. Obviously, there's no coordination, but being able to tell your Cryomancer, hey, there's guys in this room, Cryomancer, drops a Q as you open the door, sends it in, gets both of them, easy clap, the fight's over. So for these reasons, Druid is definitely going to be finding itself in the S plus tier for duos as well. Hopping into the trios tier list, and honestly, this one's going to be a little bit shorter than the previous two because a lot of things have already been covered, but the meta in trios is quite a bit different. So if you are mainly a trios player, I would definitely recommend sticking around to see where I place things if that's something you're interested in. So starting off once again with the fighter, I'm going to be placing it in the S tier again. Think similarly to duos, it's very strong because it works well with most comps. It can be a good frontliner in most situations. Probably the only reason it's not going into S plus tier is just due to the kind of overarching strength of ranged damage and even ranged comps in general right now in trios from my experience. But it's certainly one of the best melee classes when it comes to trios right now, so it's going to be finding itself in the S tier. Moving on from the fighter and on to the priest, and finally priest is finding itself home in the 3v3 mode, so it's going to be going into the S tier. Its group utility is quite strong, and unlike in solos and duos where you don't get that much value, you actually get a lot of value in group play. Their E ability guard allows you to place a shield on all of your allies pretty much permanently. One of their perks turns that shield into a cleanse. So if any of your allies ever get thunderclapped flasked, you can pop guard and remove the slow, which is very clutch in a lot of situations, especially because thunderclaps typically lead to death right now. Their healing is very useful, and especially in situations where you're going to hell and Sinner's End, or you're going through the shadow portal, they're very, very useful in boss fights. They do a lot of damage to bosses with the staff and are really good in any comp that wants to do bosses or PvP. After the priest, and we have the rogue. Once again, they're going to be going in the A tier. Similarly to how they operate in duos, they're quite particular in the way they want to play fights. They don't really want to head-on engage. They kind of want to do this in and out game where they're poking you and doing damage, whittling you down, waiting for the right opportunity, which is not particularly cohesive with most other comps in trios right now. Obviously, they don't have access to anything like the lightning staff, which is definitely a negative for them. So for all of these reasons, they are going to be finding themselves in the A tier. Following the rogue, and we have the cryo. Similar to duos, they're going to be going into the S plus tier. They are a pinnacle of the trios gameplay meta right now. Ice Storm, same as in duos, is just extremely strong. And a lot of fights in trios right now are determined by which team is more effectively using their Ice Storm, which team is thunderclapping people to set up their cryo to guarantee the Ice Storms. And especially if you're running like a caster comp or a ranged comp, or a boss farming comp, which typically from what I can tell right now, a lot of boss farming comps want to run multiple casters. They do bosses extremely quick, but in all of these situations, cryo is extremely strong. If it were up to me, I would have a cryo on my team in every single game in trios right now, and yeah, they are extremely strong. Probably the best class in the game for trios at the moment. Following the cryo, and we have the pyromancer. They are also going to be joining the cryo in the S plus tier for honestly a lot of the same reasons. They're extremely good at bossing, very good at PvP. Their neutral game, where both teams are kind of looking at each other, is extremely strong. You have the ability to kind of slowly walk forward as a team, and your pyromancer can just push people back every time he hits a fireball. It's chunking somebody for half their HP. They've got to reset, pop a bandage, pop a health potion, etc. Especially, considering the fact that you also have two teammates to kind of supplement the weakness that you have in solos and duos, which is the fact that your E is not the best form of self-peel compared to some of the other classes. But now that you've got more teammates to, support you in that regard, they do become kind of just a massive DPS output in most trios fights. If they're able to, or if your team is able to set up your pyromancer to just unleash pyroblasts on people without getting countered, you can 100% just roll over teams with that alone. So for these reasons, pyromancer is definitely finding itself in the S plus tier. Moving on to the Death Knight, and Death Knight is going to be going in the S tier once again, same as duos. Still quite strong. If you want to bring a melee into your trios comp, I think, Death Knight, Fighter, honestly, all of the melees except Rogue feel very similar in power. They're great front line, they do quite a bit of damage. I think they're, as I said before, honestly a bit more difficult than the caster comps right now. You need to know how to use your mace in trios. If you ever walk up too far forward, get thunderclapped and ice stormed, and you don't have a priest to like bail you out, but even if you have a priest to bail you out, like it's probably not going to save you. If you have multiple, 2 or 3 casters layering their ice, or not their ice, but layering their lightning staff heavy attacks on top of you, you will just fall over and pretty much cost your team the fight, which, makes it quite a bit more difficult than playing like a triple caster comp and you just fish for an ice storm. Once you finally hit the ice storm, you just nuke that person down. But with all that being said, I do still think Death Knight is pretty strong, especially in Sinner's End. They're a little bit better than Castle, where you can kind of find people in closed corridors, get on them quickly without getting too much damage taken in the process. So for all of these reasons, they're going to be finding themselves in the S tier. Following the Death Knight, we have the Swordmaster. Similarly to the other melee classes, it is also going to find itself in the S tier. I think it's very comparable in strength to the Death Knight and Fighter. It is quite tanky with its E, as I've said before. The main difference is that it's just very quick, so it's maybe a tiny bit more effective than the DK and Fighter because you can kind of work around your other casters that are in the comp better than a DK and Fighter. You can also, support them with some range damage via your Q, but realistically, they're still very similar in strength, and I just don't think they're quite as good as running some of the triple caster comps that are really messing up the trios lobbies at this point. And for our final class, we're going to have the Druid, and surprise, surprise, it is going to once again be going into the S+ tier. Even after the nerfs on the 29th patch, or on the patch on the 29th, they are just still incredibly strong, as I've demonstrated in the solos and duos tier list. Their ability to use the lightning staffs makes them pair extremely well with the other casters. Their wall hacks pretty much eliminates the possibility of you ever getting snuck up on by a melee comp or snuck up on by, a Swordmaster, DK Fighter, whatever the case may be, which honestly is actually more important than it sounds, because if you're running a triple caster comp, you want some of your casters to be running double lightning staff. As Druid, you're probably going to be doing that as well. And you never want a fighter to sneak up on you and get a whirlwind off because you don't have an orb to be able to block. So having those wall hacks, allowing your Cryomancer to really, have the best opportunity possible to land a good ice storm is pretty invaluable, I'm going to be honest. I would say they're second to the Cryomancer for being the strongest class in the game in trios. And yeah, I will just say, on top of all of those things that they've already got going for them, they probably do some of the most boss damage in the game. And if you run a comp like Cryo, Pyromancer, and Druid, you can literally melt bosses like no other. It is kind of insane. So yeah, those 3 classes are definitely kind of dominating the trios meta at this point. But that's going to go ahead and conclude all of the tier lists. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have a spare moment, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later, chefs. And last but not least, take it easy, chefs. As you fade away.